It's hard to know when a bad idea will take shape in your life. Sometimes it's when you make a harmless decision, like agreeing to help a neighbor. Other times, it creeps up on you when you're already in the thick of it, realizing too late that you should have backed out when you had the chance. For me, it all started with my neighbor, Jim, and his wife, Laura. I lived alone in a small, quiet town in the Adirondacks, where the trees were endless and the mountains seemed to swallow the sky. It was 2019, the year I'd finally decided to buy a cabin far from the noise of the world. My property was nestled deep in the woods, with only a dirt road connecting me to civilization. My nearest neighbors, Jim and Laura, lived about a quarter-mile away with Laura's 2 kids, Jake and Emily, from her previous marriage. Jim was the type of guy who seemed friendly on the surface but had an edge to him that made people keep their distance. Laura, on the other hand, was soft-spoken and kind, though there was always something guarded in her eyes. Her kids, Jake, who was 12, and Emily, who was 9, seemed like normal kids, but I rarely saw them outside. Their house had a weathered look, like it hadn't been updated in decades, but it fit into the woods like it belonged there. One summer evening, Jim stopped by my place. He stood on my porch, hands shoved in his pockets, shifting his weight like he was in a hurry but needed something. "We're heading out to our family cabin for a week," he said. "It's further up in the woods. Thought you might like to come along." The invitation caught me off guard. I wasn't particularly close to Jim or Laura, but I'd helped them out a couple of times, clearing snow off their driveway last winter and lending Jim some tools. Still, I hesitated. "It's just good to have an extra set of hands," Jim added quickly. "The kids can be a handful, and the place needs some fixing up. Plus, it'll be nice to get out there before summer's gone." I wanted to say no. Spending a week in a remote cabin with people I barely knew didn't exactly sound like my idea of fun, but I felt cornered, so I agreed. The next morning, I followed their old SUV up a narrow, overgrown trail deeper into the forest. The drive took nearly an hour, the road twisting and turning as it climbed higher into the mountains. Finally, we reached the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees. The place was larger than I expected, with a sagging roof and peeling paint. "Home sweet home," Jim said, gesturing at the cabin. As we unloaded the SUV, Laura tried to corral the kids, who were already running around the property. The cabin's interior was as run down as the outside, dust-covered furniture, creaky floors, and a faint smell of mildew. Jim explained that the place had been in Laura's family for years, but hadn't been used much since her father passed away. After settling in, Jim and I got to work on some basic repairs while Laura cooked and kept an eye on the kids. It felt like any other cabin trip, tiring but uneventful. That changed on the second night. We were sitting around the fire pit outside, the kids roasting marshmallows while Jim told some story about a bear sighting years ago. I'd been listening half-heartedly when I noticed movement in the woods. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it again, a shadow slipping between the trees. Probably just a deer, I thought, but it left me uneasy. Later that night, as I lay in my room, I heard footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps like someone was circling the place. I stayed still, listening. The footsteps stopped, then started again, moving closer to my window. I sat up and looked out, but the night was pitch black. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. The next morning, I mentioned the noise to Jim. He shrugged it off. "Probably an animal," he said, but I noticed he kept his rifle closer than before. Over the next couple of days, little things started happening. Laura's tools went missing, only to reappear in strange places. The kids claimed they heard someone whispering outside their window at night, but Jim brushed it off as their imagination. Then, on the 4th night, things escalated. We were all inside the cabin when we heard a loud crash from the back. Jim grabbed his rifle and we went to check it out. The back door had been forced open, the lock splintered. "Stay inside," Jim told Laura, who huddled with the kids. We stepped outside, scanning the woods with flashlights. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. "Could be a bear," Jim muttered, but I could tell he didn't believe it. We didn't find anything, but neither of us slept much that night. The next day, Jim decided to cut the trip short. We packed up quickly, loading the SUV. As we were about to leave, Jake realized he'd left his favorite toy in the cabin. Jim cursed under his breath but handed me the keys. "Mind grabbing it? It's on the kitchen table," he said. I went back inside, and that's when I saw it. A single muddy footprint on the floor, too large to belong to any of us. It led from the back door to the kitchen and then stopped. I grabbed the toy and bolted out of there, locking the door behind me. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Back at home, I tried to put the trip behind me, but something about it stuck with me. A week later, I saw Laura at the grocery store. She looked exhausted, her eyes darting around nervously. "We're selling the cabin," she said abruptly. "Why?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "There's something wrong with that place," she said quietly, then walked away. I never found out who or what had been in those woods with us, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never set foot near that cabin again. It was 2019, and I was a 32-year-old construction worker living in a small, rainy town nestled deep in the Pacific Northwest. My boss, Doug, was the kind of guy who always pushed his employees to go above and beyond. When he called me one stormy Friday evening, I knew he was about to ask for a favor. He wanted me to spend the weekend working on his new cabin in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't a request, it was more of an expectation. Doug had recently bought a piece of land about 40 miles out of town, up in the dense woods where cell service was a luxury and the roads turned into muddy trails. He had been bragging about this dream cabin for months, and now he was determined to have it finished before winter hit. He needed someone he trusted to oversee the construction, and I was his pick. I didn't want to go. It had been raining heavily for days, and the thought of spending my weekend drenched and cold didn't sit well with me. But Doug had a way of making you feel like you owed him. So, by Saturday morning, I found myself loading up my truck with tools and supplies, grumbling under my breath. The drive was miserable. Sheets of rain battered my windshield, and the winding roads were slick with mud. By the time I reached the turnoff to the cabin site, the dirt trail was practically a river. My truck skidded and slid as I navigated the narrow path, trees looming on either side like silent sentinels. When I finally arrived, the cabin was barely a skeleton of what it was supposed to be. The wooden frame was up, but the roof was incomplete, and the interior was nothing more than a muddy mess of scattered tools and lumber. There wasn't even a proper door yet, just a tarp flapping in the wind where the entrance would eventually be. I parked my truck and took a moment to assess the situation. The rain had let up slightly, but dark clouds still churned overhead. The site was eerily quiet, save for the sound of water dripping from the trees and the occasional gust of wind. I got to work immediately. My first task was to secure the tarp over the unfinished roof to keep the interior somewhat dry. Climbing up the makeshift ladder, I felt the structure sway slightly under my weight. The wood was damp and slick, and every step felt like a gamble. As the day wore on, the rain returned with a vengeance. I worked as quickly as I could, hammering and sawing in a race against the weather. My clothes were soaked through, and my fingers were numb, but I kept going. By late afternoon, the light was fading, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. I decided to call it a day and hunker down for the night. Doug had mentioned a small camper on the property that I could use, but when I went to look for it, I realized it was more of an afterthought than a proper shelter. The camper was old and battered, parked under a cluster of trees a few hundred feet from the cabin. Inside, it smelled of mildew and stale air. The tiny space was cramped and barely furnished, with a rickety cot, a propane stove, and a lantern that barely gave off any light. I set up my sleeping bag on the cot and tried to get comfortable, but the sound of the rain pounding on the metal roof made it nearly impossible to relax. That's when I first noticed the sound. First, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking lightly on wood. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the cabin. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks, but the sound was too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Always 3 knocks, then silence. It would stop for a few minutes, then start again. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and pulled on my rain jacket, stepping out into the cold, wet night. The rain had eased up a little, but the ground was a muddy mess, and every step was a struggle. As I approached the cabin, the tapping stopped. I shone my flashlight around the site, but there was nothing unusual, just the unfinished structure and the surrounding trees, their branches swaying in the wind. I walked around the cabin, checking the tarp and the frame for anything that might be making the noise. Everything seemed secure, but as I turned to head back to the camper, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was louder, and it was coming from inside the cabin. My heart was pounding as I stepped through the tarp-covered entrance. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the half-built interior. There was no one there. I stood in the center of the cabin, listening intently. The sound didn't come again, but the silence was somehow worse. The only noise was the rain dripping from the tarp and the creaking of the wooden frame in the wind. I tried to shake off the unease and headed back to the camper. But as I lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. The next day was just as miserable as the first. The rain was relentless, and the muddy sight made every task twice as difficult. But I forced myself to focus on the work, determined to finish as much as I could before dark. As evening approached, the strange tapping started again. This time, I didn't go looking for the source. I stayed in the camper, trying to ignore the noise. But the more I ignored it, the louder it seemed to get. By the third night, I was on edge. The tapping had become a constant presence, and I was starting to hear other sounds, too. Rustling in the trees, footsteps in the mud. I hadn't seen anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to leave first thing in the morning. The cabin could wait. I packed up my tools and supplies, ready to get out of there as soon as the sun came up. But when I went to start my truck, it wouldn't turn over. The engine sputtered and died no matter how many times I tried. I popped the hood, but I couldn't see anything obviously wrong. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, but they were definitely there. Muddy prints leading from the cabin to my truck and then disappearing into the woods. They weren't mine. Panic set in. I grabbed my flashlight and started scanning the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The woods were dark and silent, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I spent the rest of the day trying to fix my truck, but nothing worked. As night fell, I was forced to retreat back to the camper. I locked the door and kept the flashlight close, every creak and rustle outside setting my nerves on edge. The tapping started again, louder than ever. This time, it was right outside the camper. I held my breath, clutching the flashlight like a weapon, but I didn't dare go out. The sound continued for hours, relentless and unchanging. By the time morning came, I was a wreck. I threw my gear into the truck and started walking. It took me most of the day to reach the main road, where I flagged down a passing car. I never went back to the cabin, and Doug never asked why. To this day, I don't know what was out there, Maybe it was just someone messing with me, but every time it rains, I can still hear that sound in my head. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't think much of it when Sarah suggested we spend a weekend at her aunt's old cabin. She described it as rustic but cozy, tucked deep in the woods, a place she used to visit as a child. We had been engaged for 6 months, and with work and wedding planning, the idea of a quiet weekend sounded perfect. Her aunt, Helen, had moved out of state years ago, leaving the cabin untouched since the late 90s. Sarah had fond memories of it and wanted to share a piece of her past with me. It was mid-October, and the air was starting to get crisp. The drive to the cabin was long, nearly 4 hours from the city, and the last hour was spent navigating winding gravel roads that snaked through thick forests. As we drove deeper into the woods, cell service became spotty, then non-existent. The trees were tall and dense, their branches arching over the road like a tunnel. The occasional break in the canopy revealed a sky that was already starting to darken, even though it wasn't late. When we arrived, the cabin was exactly what I expected from Sarah's description. Small, weathered, and sitting in a clearing surrounded by towering trees. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood siding was gray and peeling, the windows were dusty, and the front porch sagged slightly in the middle. A pile of firewood was stacked haphazardly against the side, and an old stone chimney jutted out from the roof. Inside, the air was musty, and the furniture was covered in sheets. There were mismatched chairs, a worn couch, and a small table in the kitchen area. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a living area with a fireplace. It wasn't much, but it had a certain charm that Sarah seemed to love. She was beaming as she pulled the sheets off the furniture and opened the windows to let in fresh air. We spent the first hour tidying up. Sarah swept the floors while I checked the fireplace to make sure it was usable. There was an old oil lantern on the mantel, along with a stack of yellowed newspapers and a dusty clock that had stopped ticking long ago. In the kitchen, the cabinets were filled with mismatched dishes and a few cans of expired food. I chuckled at the sight of a bag of instant coffee from the early 90s. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. We lit a fire in the fireplace, and the cabin was soon filled with a warm, flickering glow. Sarah cooked a simple dinner on the old gas stove, and we ate at the small kitchen table. Outside, the woods were completely silent. No cars, no voices, not even the sound of wind. It was unnervingly quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. After dinner, we sat by the fire and talked about the wedding. Sarah pulled out an old photo album she had found in one of the bedrooms. The pictures were faded, but I could see her as a child, playing in the woods and sitting on the porch with her aunt. There were a few pictures of Helen, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a warm smile. But there were other photos, too, people I didn't recognize. Sarah explained they were neighbors who used to live nearby, though the closest house was miles away. When it was time for bed, I noticed how dark it was outside. Without the city lights, the night seemed endless. The only sound was the occasional crackle of the fire. We crawled into the old bed, and Sarah fell asleep quickly. I lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling and listening to the creaks and groans of the old cabin. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A soft scratching, like something was brushing against the side of the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The sound came again, this time from the direction of the living room. It wasn't consistent, just a faint scratch every few seconds. I told myself it was probably an animal. The cabin was old, and it wouldn't surprise me if mice or squirrels had found their way inside. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The scratching stopped, But now I could hear faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the porch. I didn't want to wake Sarah, so I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I winced at the sound. I grabbed the old oil lantern from the bedside table and lit it, the faint flame casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. In the living room, the fire had burned down to embers, and the room was filled with a dim orange glow. I stood there for a moment, listening. The footsteps had stopped, and the cabin was silent again. I walked to the front door and peered out through the small window. The porch was empty, but the woods beyond were pitch black. I couldn't see anything past the first few feet of trees. Just as I was about to turn away, I heard it again. A faint sound, this time coming from the back of the cabin. My pulse quickened as I realized whatever it was had moved. I tightened my grip on the lantern and made my way to the back door. It was locked, but the thought of someone, or something, out there made me uneasy. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I barely slept. When morning came, I felt foolish for being so paranoid. Sarah teased me for looking tired, but I didn't tell her what I had heard. I didn't want to ruin the weekend. We spent the day exploring the woods, following old trails that Sarah remembered from her childhood. The forest was dense, and the trees seemed to close in around us the further we went. At one point, we stumbled upon an old hunting blind, its wooden frame rotting and overgrown with moss. Sarah said she didn't remember it being there, but it looked like it had been abandoned for years. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking in the trees, but there was nothing. Sarah didn't seem to notice anything unusual, so I kept my thoughts to myself. That night, the scratching started again, this time louder and more persistent. It wasn't just on one side of the cabin, it moved, first on the walls, then the roof. I could hear it clearly, like claws scraping against wood. Sarah woke up this time, and I could see the fear in her eyes. She whispered that it was probably an animal, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. We stayed in bed, too scared to move, as the scratching continued for what felt like hours. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I didn't sleep at all that night, and when morning came, I decided we needed to leave. As we packed up, I noticed something strange. The firewood pile outside had been disturbed, logs scattered across the ground. Near the back of the cabin, the dirt was disturbed, like someone had been digging. I didn't say anything to Sarah, but I felt a growing sense of dread. The drive back to the city was quiet. Sarah stared out the window, lost in thought, while I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us. When we finally reached the safety of our apartment, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It wasn't until weeks later, when Sarah called her aunt to tell her about the trip, that we learned the truth. Helen seemed surprised we had gone to the cabin. She mentioned something about a break-in years ago, but she didn't go into detail. All she said was that she stopped visiting after finding strange symbols carved into the trees around the property. I never told Sarah, but I couldn't stop thinking about those sounds in the night. The footsteps, the scratching, the digging. I started to wonder if we had been alone out there after all. I was 34 when I made the worst decision of my life. I wasn't a bad person, not really, but desperation has a way of making people do things they wouldn't normally consider. It was the summer of 1998, and I was in Oregon trying to outrun a storm I had created. My life had fallen apart. Debts, failed jobs, and a crumbling marriage, but it was the robbery that sealed my fate. A botched convenience store holdup gone wrong left me with blood on my hands and a warrant out for my arrest. I ran. The Pacific Northwest was vast, its forests dense and unyielding. I figured if I could just disappear into its green expanse, maybe I could buy myself some time. I drove until my car sputtered and died on a back road somewhere near the Cascade Range. From there, I packed what little I could carry: some cans of food, a hunting knife, and a water bottle, and vanished into the trees. I wandered for days, sleeping in the open, eating sparingly, and avoiding any sign of people. The fear of being caught kept me moving, but the physical exhaustion was starting to catch up. My mind played tricks on me in the silence of the forest. Every crack of a branch sounded like a pursuit. Every shadow seemed to move. On the 5th day, I stumbled upon salvation, or so I thought. It was an old cabin, tucked deep in the woods, hidden behind a screen of overgrown pines and moss-covered boulders. It looked abandoned. The roof sagged, the windows were grimy, and the wood siding was grayed and weathered. Still, it was shelter, and I was desperate. I circled the cabin cautiously, looking for signs of recent use. There were none. The door was locked, but the window on the side was broken, so I used my jacket to clear the remaining shards and climbed in. The inside was dark and musty, with the smell of damp wood and rot filling the air. The cabin was small, just one main room with a wood stove, a rickety table, and a single cot pushed against the wall. Dust covered everything, and cobwebs draped the corners. It didn't seem like anyone had been there in years. I felt a flicker of relief. I unpacked my bag and took stock of my supplies. I had enough food for a few more days, but I'd need water soon. The cabin had an old well outside, but when I tested it, the water smelled metallic and foul. I decided to rely on the small stream I'd crossed earlier in the day. The first night in the cabin was uneventful, but I barely slept. My mind was a tangled mess of guilt, fear, and the oppressive quiet of the forest. I told myself I just needed to lay low for a while. No one would come looking for me here, not in a place so remote. But by the 2nd day, I started to notice things. It began with small noises, scratches at the window, the faint sound of something brushing against the cabin walls at night. I told myself it was animals. The forest was full of them, after all. But then there were the footprints. I found them on the 3rd morning, just outside the cabin. They were faint, pressed into the soft dirt near the well. At first, I thought they might be mine, but they were too large, the pattern of the tread unfamiliar. Someone had been here. Panic set in. I stayed inside the cabin all day, peering through the grimy windows at the surrounding forest. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call made my heart race. By nightfall, I was questioning my own sanity. Had I really seen those footprints? Was the isolation playing tricks on me? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hiker, someone passing through. But why would they come so close to the cabin? On the 4th night, I heard the knocking. It was faint at first, a gentle tap 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 against the door. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The knocking stopped, but then it came again, louder this time. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Minutes passed in silence, and then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I gripped the hunting knife in my hand, my palms slick with sweat. Whoever it was, they didn't try to come in. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded into the distance. Morning brought no comfort. I found more footprints, clearer this time, leading from the well to the cabin and back into the forest. Whoever it was had been watching me. I debated leaving, but where would I go? My car was miles away, and I couldn't risk being seen on the roads. The forest was endless. I could easily get lost. Instead, I fortified the cabin. I moved the table and cot against the door and window, making it harder for anyone to get in. I kept the knife with me at all times, sleeping with it clutched in my hand. But the intrusions didn't stop. Over the next few nights, the knocking continued, always at the same time. Once, I thought I heard whispering, low and guttural, just outside the window. I was too afraid to look. The final night was the worst. It started with the knocking, louder than before, more insistent. Then came the footsteps, not just one set, but several. They surrounded the cabin, the sound of boots crunching on dry leaves. I felt trapped like a cornered animal. My heart pounded in my chest as I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the knife. And then the door began to creak. They were trying to get in. I don't remember much of what happened next. Fear took over, and I lashed out wildly, screaming into the darkness. When the door finally gave way, I bolted for the broken window, cutting my arms and legs as I scrambled out. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the stream, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. I hid beneath a cluster of rocks, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, I made my way back to the cabin, half expecting it to be destroyed. But it wasn't. The door hung open, the table and cot shoved aside, but everything else was untouched. Inside, I found a single item left on the floor, a photograph. It was old, the edges curled and yellowed, but the image was clear. It was the cabin years ago with a family standing in front of it. A man, a woman, and 2 children, but their faces were scratched out, gouged into the paper with something sharp. I left the cabin that day. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I couldn't stay there any longer. I walked for hours, finally stumbling onto a ranger station on the edge of the forest. I told them I was lost, that I'd been hiking and got turned around. They didn't question me, just gave me water and a ride to the nearest town. I never went back to that forest, and I've spent every day since wondering if they're still out there, watching, waiting for someone else to find their cabin. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the knocking. I never truly knew my grandmother's past. She didn't talk about it much, and I never pressed her for details. All I knew was that she had once been married to a man named Walter, and that their relationship ended long before I was born. When I turned 23, I visited her cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine for the first time. I was spending a few months off work, trying to clear my head after a rough breakup, and she offered me the place as a retreat. The cabin was old, built in the early 1950s. It had been her retreat after she left Walter. As far as I knew, she had lived there briefly, then moved closer to the city. Now, it was mostly abandoned except for the occasional family visit. She warned me it was in rough shape, but I figured some fresh air and isolation would do me good. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how secluded it was. The gravel driveway stretched for half a mile, winding through thick pines. The cabin itself was small, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, and the only source of power was an old generator in the shed. Inside, it was exactly what I expected: dusty, cold, and cramped. The furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. A wood stove sat in the corner, and shelves lined the walls, packed with canned food and old books. I found a journal on the table that must have belonged to my grandmother. I didn't plan to read it. It felt like an invasion of privacy, but curiosity got the better of me. Most of it was mundane, lists of chores, recipes, and notes about the weather. But then I found an entry dated October 15th, 1972. It read, "Walter came by again today. He was standing in the tree line watching the cabin. I didn't let him see me, but I know he knows I'm here. I need to figure out what to do. I can't stay here if he's going to keep coming back." The entry made me uneasy. I had always assumed their separation was amicable, but this hinted at something darker. I tried to shake it off. It was decades ago and Walter was long gone. Still, I locked the door that night before going to bed. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time hiking, chopping wood, and trying to fix up the cabin. The isolation was peaceful but also unnerving. At night, the silence was so complete that every creak of the floorboards or rustle of leaves outside set my nerves on edge. One morning, I woke to find footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They weren't mine. They were too large, and the tread didn't match my boots. I told myself it was probably a hunter or a lost hiker, but it still made me uneasy. The next day, I found a rusted axe leaning against the back wall of the cabin. I hadn't noticed it before, but it looked out of place. The handle was splintered, and the blade was dull, but it seemed deliberate, as if someone had left it there recently. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, branches snapping, leaves crunching. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I went back to the journal the next morning, hoping for answers. Another entry stood out. Walter left something outside the cabin today, an axe leaning against the back wall. He's trying to scare me, but I won't let him. I just need to hold out a little longer. He'll leave eventually. My stomach dropped. The axe I found, it matched her description. Was someone trying to mess with me? Or was this just some strange coincidence? I decided to search the cabin more thoroughly. In the closet, I found a box of old photographs. Most were of my grandmother and her family, but one photo caught my eye. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a stern expression. On the back, someone had written Walter, 1968. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to piece together what had happened between them. The journal suggested something sinister, but I didn't have enough to go on. That evening, I was chopping wood when I saw him, a man standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the clearing. He was too far away for me to make out his face, but he was watching me. I froze, the axe still in my hand. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I dropped the axe and ran inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise outside made my heart race. I kept thinking about the journal, about Walter, and about the man in the woods. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things, loaded them into the car, and drove back to the city. But as I pulled onto the main road, I saw something in the rearview mirror. It was the man, standing in the driveway, watching me leave. I told my grandmother about what happened, hoping for answers, but she just shook her head and said, "Some things are better left in the past." I never went back to the cabin. A year later, it burned down in a fire. No one knew how it started, but I couldn't help but wonder if it was deliberate. To this day, I don't know who the man was or what he wanted. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the journal and the entries my grandmother wrote, and I wonder if Walter ever really left those woods. I've never been a fan of cabins in the woods. My wife, Sarah, on the other hand, loved them. She grew up camping with her family, and she'd always talk about how the woods were peaceful, like a sanctuary away from everything. After weeks of her convincing me, I finally agreed to rent a remote cabin for a weekend getaway. It wasn't my ideal way to relax, but Sarah was excited, and I couldn't say no to that smile. We chose a cabin in northern Minnesota, deep in the woods, far from cell service and any signs of civilization. It was late October 2022, just after the leaves had fallen but before the first snowfall. The air was crisp, and the days were short. Perfect timing for Sarah. She loved the cold and the quiet of fall. For me, the isolation was unnerving, but I told myself to shake it off. This was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. The drive to the cabin was long and winding. The paved road eventually turned into gravel, and then the gravel turned into dirt. After nearly 2 hours of driving through dense woods, we arrived at the cabin. It was small but cozy, with a weathered wooden exterior and a wraparound porch. Behind it was a thick wall of towering pines. A small lake shimmered in the distance, barely visible through the trees. The closest neighbor was over 15 miles away. Rustic charm, Sarah had called it. To me, it looked like the perfect setting for a horror movie, but I kept that to myself. Sarah was thrilled, and I didn't want to ruin it for her. We unloaded our bags and stepped inside. The interior was just as rustic as the outside. Wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and old furniture that looked like it hadn't been replaced in decades. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and no cell signal. Just us and the woods. The first day went by uneventfully. Sarah spent the afternoon exploring the area around the cabin while I chopped some firewood and got the fireplace going. We cooked dinner together and ate by the fire. The warmth of the flames and the crackling of the wood were comforting. For the first time that day, I started to relax. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness enveloped the woods, that unease crept back in. The silence was suffocating. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind outside, it all felt too loud, too deliberate. Sarah didn't seem to notice. She was curled up on the couch, reading a book, completely at ease. I told myself I was being paranoid. I woke up the next morning to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was Sarah, but when I looked over, she was still in bed, sound asleep. My heart started pounding. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, crunching on the frost-covered ground. I froze, listening intently. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I didn't tell Sarah about it. She would have brushed it off as a deer or some other animal, and maybe she was right. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the day on edge, constantly glancing out the windows. Nothing seemed out of place, but that didn't ease my nerves. That night, after we'd gone to bed, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps that woke me. It was the sound of the front door creaking open. My blood ran cold. I reached over to wake Sarah, but she was already awake, staring at me with wide eyes. She had heard it too. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept out of the bedroom, my heart hammering in my chest. The living room was empty, but the front door was ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. The beam illuminated the empty porch and the surrounding woods, but there was no sign of anyone. I locked the door and double-checked all the windows before going back to bed. The next morning, I found footprints outside the cabin. They were human, barefoot, and they circled the cabin several times before disappearing into the woods. My stomach churned. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching us. I wanted to leave right then and there, but Sarah insisted we stay. She thought I was overreacting, that the footprints could have been from days ago. I didn't argue, but I didn't feel safe. I spent the rest of the day on high alert, keeping an axe within arm's reach and glancing out the windows every few minutes. That night was the worst. Couldn't sleep. Every sound, every shadow outside the window made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I heard it again, the footsteps. This time they were heavier, closer. I lay there, clutching the axe, waiting for something to happen. Then the doorknob rattled. Sarah bolted upright in bed, her face pale. We both stared at the bedroom door, barely breathing. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the cabin. Someone had broken a window. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. I handed Sarah the flashlight and told her to stay put while I checked it out. My hands were shaking as I stepped into the living room. One of the windows was shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. The front door was still locked. I shone the flashlight around the room, my grip tightening on the axe. That's when I saw it. A muddy footprint on the floor, leading toward the kitchen. Whoever it was, they were still inside. I turned off the flashlight, plunging the cabin into darkness. My eyes adjusted slowly, and I strained to hear any movement. The cabin was deathly silent, but I knew they were there. I could feel it. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the kitchen, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps running out the back door. I bolted after them, my adrenaline overriding my fear. I threw open the back door and scanned the darkness, but whoever it was had disappeared into the woods. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, we packed up and left the cabin, leaving everything else behind. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whoever it was wasn't far behind. When we got home, I reported the incident to the local authorities, but they didn't find anything. No suspects, no evidence. Just a cabin in the woods with a shattered window and a few muddy footprints. Sarah hasn't mentioned going back to a cabin since. And me? I can't look at the woods without feeling like someone is standing just out of sight, watching, waiting. It was 2016, and I had just turned 35. My name is Eric, and I worked as a security specialist for a private company. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills. My assignment that night was at a remote cabin located deep in the woods of Montana. The cabin belonged to a wealthy businessman who wanted it guarded whenever he was out of town. He was paranoid about theft, even though the location was so secluded that the nearest town was about 50 miles away. I'd been on this assignment a few times before. It usually involved long hours of solitude, patrolling the property and monitoring the security system. The cabin was massive, built like a fortress with high-tech cameras and motion detectors. It sat at the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by silence. Nights there were eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or the hoot of an owl breaking the stillness. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was setting. The sky turned a deep orange, casting long shadows across the property. The gravel driveway crunched under the tires of my truck as I pulled up to the cabin. I parked near the front door and unloaded my gear: a flashlight, a thermos of coffee, a snack, and my sidearm, which was standard issue for the job. The cabin's interior was modern and minimalist, a stark contrast to its rugged exterior. The owner had spared no expense on the security system. A wall of monitors in the living room displayed live feeds from cameras positioned around the property. Motion sensors dotted the perimeter, and the system was set to alert me to any disturbances. After a quick inspection of the cabin and its surroundings, I settled into the living room. The monitors flickered with black and white images of the forest, the driveway, and the rear of the cabin. Everything was quiet, too quiet as it always felt out here. By 9 p.m., the darkness outside was absolute. The cabin's windows reflected the interior, making it hard to see out. I was used to this, but it still put me on edge. There's something unnerving about being alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by darkness so thick it feels like a presence of its own. Around 11 p.m., I decided to do my first patrol. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me immediately, and my breath formed small clouds in the beam of the flashlight. I walked the perimeter, scanning the trees and checking the motion sensors. Everything was in order. The forest felt alive, but not in a comforting way. Branches creaked in the wind, and unseen animals scurried through the underbrush. I thought I saw something move between the trees at one point, but when I aimed my flashlight in that direction, there was nothing there. I chalked it up to my imagination and headed back inside. The hours dragged on. By 2 a.m., I was struggling to stay awake. I kept my eyes on the monitors, sipping coffee to keep myself alert. The cameras showed nothing but the same static views of the forest. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was too quiet even for this place. At 3 a.m., the motion detector near the rear of the property went off. A soft beep from the security system jolted me awake. I leaned forward, scanning the monitors for any sign of movement. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, on the camera covering the tree line, I spotted it, a faint flicker of movement. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside. My footsteps were muffled by the soft earth as I made my way toward the rear of the property. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees. I scanned the area where the motion detector had been triggered but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just trees and shadows. I was about to head back to the cabin when I heard it, a low, guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was faint, almost like a growl, coming from deeper in the woods. I froze, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't an animal I recognized. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight pointed toward the trees. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm. I didn't want to draw it unless absolutely necessary, but whatever was out there didn't feel natural. When I got back inside, I locked the door and reset the security system. I checked the monitors again, but the cameras showed nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there. The rest of the night was tense. I stayed alert, watching the monitors and listening for any sounds outside. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the gravel driveway, but when I checked the cameras, the area was empty. By dawn, the uneasiness had settled into my bones. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, I finally felt a sense of relief. I did one last patrol of the property before packing up my gear. Nothing seemed out of place, but that didn't mean much. As I drove away from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched all night. Whatever had been out there hadn't been an animal. I was sure of that. It wasn't the last time I'd take a night shift at the cabin, but it was the first time I truly felt afraid. Sometimes the most unsettling thing isn't what you see, it's what you don't.